Let's continue looking at moral foundations theory, and now we're going to look at the 6 moral foundations, the heart of the theory. So moral foundations theory is especially associated with Jonathan Haidt, and his book in 2012 is the most popular presentation of it. And there's 3 main ideas. The first is that people make moral judgments determining what's good or bad, what they're going to do or what they're not going to do, what they condemn in others or what they support in others, primarily using moral intuitions. So those are the automatic processes that occur in us, like emotions, the moral emotions, to determine whether something is good or bad. Now, this is just the primary way. We also use rational thought, but it's mainly through emotion, according to moral foundations theory. But the moral foundation, or the moral intuitions that people experience, vary by both individual and culture. So the culture that we grow up in will teach us that to respond very negatively to some things and not to others. For example, the type of food that you can eat or cannot eat very much has to do with the culture or the religion that you grew up in. But it can also depend on your own personal values. So the moral intuitions don't just vary by culture, but by individual. Now, what can influence an individual? Certainly genetics can. Also, the family situation, everything in the environment that a person grew up with, but also a person's own thoughts, their own rational thinking, their own decisions can influence them. Perhaps not as much as we'd like to think that it influences people, but we do have this ability to make our own decisions and choose values. So that's the second idea, is that moral tuitions vary by individual and culture. And then a third really interesting idea of moral foundations theory, which helps explain why there's so much conflict in the world, so much disagreement on what's ethical, so many accusations, is that our mind will justify our moral judgments. It'll come up with reasons to support that our moral judgments, our emotional reactions are correct, so that everyone except us, or everybody like the people that share my values, seems like a hypocrite. So I react a certain way and I think that I'm a real ethical person. I see somebody else who doesn't react that way and I think that they're hypocritical. So, for example, I have no idea what your political orientation is. You might be to the left, you might be to the right, you might be in the center, but there is a really good chance that you think that people that are not in your group are hypocritical, because they have their moral judgments are very different than yours, and so we naturally started thinking that they're immoral, they're hypocrites. They want to say that they're doing right, but they're not. So that's why the conservatives are always bashing the liberals, and the liberals are always bashing the conservatives, and to each group sees each other as very hypocritical and unethical. So that's the basis. Those are the main ideas of moral foundations theory. But let's look at these moral foundations that shape intuitions. So, according to Jonathan Haidt, there's 6 foundations that define what our moral intuitions are going to be. For some people, some of them are important. For some people, all of them are important. And that combination of which ones are important will help determine what ethical group you feel like you fit into. So we'll come back to that idea. But let's look at the 6 foundations. The first one is this idea of care or harm. Does an event benefit others, or does an event harm others? Now, it turns out that everybody has this moral foundation. If we think that something harms others, we think that it's unethical, especially if they're part of our in-group. If it's something that benefits people, we think that it's ethical. So that's one foundation that virtually everybody agrees on. A second one is fairness and cheating. Is an event in accordance with the shared rules and equity? We saw this in organizational justice, that when there's equity, people are a lot happier, and when there's not, people see it as being unethical. So that's the second moral foundation. A third moral foundation has to do with liberty and oppression. Does an event allow people to make their own decisions about their behavior, or does it force them to act a way, even when it's against their will? And there's many people that, probably most people, think that events that give liberty are good, whereas events that oppress people and force them to do things they don't want to are bad. Those are other people that would not put that high of an emphasis on liberty and oppression. Now here's three more foundations that are a little less universally shared. First is the idea of loyalty versus betrayal. Does some event or some behavior benefit my family, those close to me, or my in-group? Is it good for my people? And a lot of people would say, oh, if it is, it's good. If it hurts my people, it's bad. How about authority versus subversion of authority? Does an event respect social norms, tradition, and legitimate authority? Some people think that's really important, and that when people aren't obeying legitimate authority, that's really unethical. And then a sixth foundation is sanctity versus degradation. Is an event holy, pure, elevated, noble, or is it something that's disgusting, contaminated, immoral, and degrading? And people will decide the value of that event, or the option of doing something like that, based on how degrading it is. So those are the 6 moral foundations. And what do these mean? One of the things that they're useful for is understanding moral groups. There's some groups that share some moral foundations with others, and there's kind of this natural affinity because they tend to view the same things as being ethical or unethical. For example, in the United States, liberals, that's the political left, emphasize the first 3 foundations. That's care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, and liberty versus oppression. And those are the 3 things that are really important to the politically left. However, conservatives, the politically right, are more likely to emphasize more or even all 6 of the foundations. And so they include loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. Now there's a lot of variety, and these are just on the averages, but it leads to some really interesting phenomena. One is most people in academia are more to the politically left, and it seems to be that way because they have fewer moral foundations. They only have the first 3 moral foundations that are in common with the political left. The conservatives, on the other hand, tend to think that there's more things that are degrading and unethical. And over the last 20 to 30 years, people have studied how academia has kind of pushed people with a broader range of moral foundations out of academia, especially in psychology. So I've put in here a link to the New Yorker article where Jonathan Haidt is interviewed, and it's an article on how conservatives, there's not much room for conservatives in a lot of academia, including psychology. So if you can download this PowerPoint, there's a link down below the video, and you can get a link to the article there. Now, another interesting phenomena is that sometimes people, and often conservatives, put a real high emphasis on authority versus subversion. And this can lead to what's known as authoritarianism, this idea that we need a strong man in government. And this has been the source of lots of wars, where you've got this strong man who wants to tell everyone how to act, and a lot of people who value that will put into power the strongman authoritarian type person. Now, it's interesting that since the end of the Cold War, this authoritarianism has especially been associated with the political right. There's not too much authoritarianism associated with the political left anymore, but during the time of communism, there very much was. But the political left has pretty much abandoned that that value. So most authoritarianism nowadays is right wing, but you can still see elements of left wing authoritarianism in Syria or in Venezuela. Now, something that's interesting is that you can go. Jonathan Haidt has a website where he's has all the scales that he used to measure the different foundations and discover the moral groups. And you can go to yourmorals.org and take a series of tests, or just one test, to see how you stand. And it does a pretty good job of predicting what groups you're likely to most identify with based on your moral foundations, what you see as really important or not important in determining whether something is ethical or not. Now, moral foundations theory is not without its critiques. One of the main critiques, or the main alternatives to moral foundations theory, is the theory of dyadic morality by Schein and Gray. And their main idea, that's a critique of the moral foundations theory, is that everyone sees harm as the basis of all moral judgments. It's not just one of the 6 foundations. It's actually what underlies all the other foundations. So if you think that cheating is bad and fairness is good, it's because you view cheating as harmful. If you view liberty as good versus oppression as bad, it's because you see oppression as harmful. If you see sanctity as good and degradation as bad, it's because you see degradation as moral. Now, when you read the Moral Foundations book, there's Jonathan Haidt has some fairly shocking illustrations for some people, but not for others. He gives some examples of sexual activity with dead animals and incest as some examples that under some conditions, there's some people that don't see them unethical, and there's other people that see them as some people see them as very unethical, and other people see them as fine under certain conditions. And but what the studies have shown is that that's not, and Haidt uses that as an example of sanctity versus degradation. But what Schein and Gray have shown is that all those things, or people that think that those behaviors are unethical, they think that they're unethical because they cause harm. People that think that they're acceptable think that they're acceptable because they don't cause harm. So what this means is that everyone shares the same moral foundation as that which causes harm to people is bad, that which doesn't harm people is acceptable, but some groups see more things causing harm than others. So, for example, conservatives see more things as causing harm than liberals. And so that's why we get these groups. So it's just a slight nuance of one of the moral foundations, the first one, harm, that sees that as an underlying basis for all the other moral foundations. So this is an overview of moral foundations theory, and it can help us understand why some people in organizations will see some behavior as unethical and other people will not see it as unethical. They have different moral foundations, and some people have more than others or different than others, which causes interpretations of what is considered unethical or not.